All right, so our next session is Dr. Susan Choo and Dr. Blair Nelson. So this is going to be a session where it's pretty much how to get into medical school. And I know that's a big reason why a lot of you are here today, because you're interested in becoming doctors, of course. And this next hour is going to be an incredible amount of information about it. And we're going to have Dr. Nelson and Dr. Choo tell us a little bit about it. And at the end, we're going to do a Q&A session as well. So as the presentation is ongoing, just like you have been today, continue writing in the Q&A, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as we can at the end of the session. And then afterwards, if we don't get to the questions, we'll be able to answer them later on. So Dr. Nelson or Dr. Chu, are you able to share your slides now?
Yeah, I got them.
Yeah.
Awesome.
You got it, Dr. Chu?
Yeah, I got it.
Thank you. I had it back up ready, just so you know I'm not slacking.
Oops. Oh, there we go.
All right, well, as you're pulling those up, it's a pleasure to be here. This is my second year doing this, so it's an honor to be back. I really enjoyed hearing Dr. Chang's very inspirational story. What an amazing story. Thank you for that. It's also an honor to present this with Dr. Chu, who has been a mentor for me. And even though I'm older than you, you still can be my mentor. Mentor for me in this kind of cosmos of pre-medical journey and applications to medical school. So, we're pretty good friends. And so I appreciate Dr. Chu taking time out of her Saturday to kind of be my co-host here. So I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm Dr. Susan Chu, and I'm one of the Associate Directors of Advising at Med School Coach. And so I've been basically in California for most of my life. More specifically, I'm sort of a UC person, I guess you could say, for my educational life. So I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad, UC San Diego for medical school, and then I came up to the Children's Hospital of Orange County to do my pediatrics residency, which then joined together with UC Irvine and are affiliated that way for pediatric residency. So I was the chief resident and associate director for the PEDS programs for both programs. And I was a general pediatrician for many years and also started working for Med School Coach. So I have since retired from clinical work, and now I just help people like yourselves with their medical school applications now.
Awesome.
And I'm going to give it back to Dr. Nelson to introduce himself.
Oh, I hate that picture. Anyway. Thanks, Dr. Chu. I kind of grew up on the other side of the world, and that's what is fun about, making colleagues and connections in healthcare and so forth. Just the diversity of healthcare professionals and how learning from each other is so fun. I grew up in rural North Dakota and attended University of North Dakota for undergraduate work. During my undergraduate experience, I actually worked as a radio disc jockey full time, which is kind of fun and is still kind of part of my non-medical passions is music and I play the drums and just following current music and so forth. And then I attended medical school at University of Minnesota, and then I did a residency in family medicine at Mayo Clinic in Arizona. And then during my residency, kind of realized that I was more drawn to the kind of rural emergency medicine pathway. So I never actually practiced family medicine. I practiced emergency medicine in rural and suburban areas for the past almost 30 years. And since kind of mid-COVID, I am pretty much retired clinically. I'm working with Med School Coach, and also I teach at a physician assistant program. So I just love the educational aspect of things, love teaching. A quick story, I remember coming home from a pretty rough overnight shift and my wife said, "You're done." And I said, we're done? What? And no, you're done. She's like, "I can't see you, kind of do another shift like that." And I loved it. Don't get me wrong. I loved it. It's a wonderful career, but after a few decades, it takes a little bit of toll on you, on your physical health. So I said, "Okay." She goes, "Well, what do you love about your job?" I said, "Well, I love to teach." And she said, "Well, that's what you're going to do." And she spoke to me and I listened. All right.
Which is always a good idea for any married people or potentially future married people.
That's right. Yeah, it hasn't gone well when I haven't. All right, so I'm going to take this next topic, Dr. Chu, if that's okay. I'm going to talk about competitiveness, and that's why everybody's here. I mean, it's no, mystery that getting into medical school is becoming harder and harder. There's some statistics that roughly uh, doubling of volume of applicants over the last decade. Um, but there's also, you know, some positive sides of things on some of these statistics. But we'll look at some of the previous years, the 2023-24 cycle. I got to put my glasses on. There were almost 52,000 applicants uh, who, of those applicants, they almost submitted almost 20 applications per applicant. So that's almost 1 million applications total. Um, but only, 23,000 of those ended up matriculating. So 55% did not get accepted. And this is why I'm not a huge fan of statistics, because it's kind of like, depends on how you look. But you can also say 45% did get accepted. So I'm a big believer in karma. So let's say, hey, 45% got in. That's not too bad. So there are some, ways to increase the probability of acceptance, and that's really what we do at med school coaches. We can't like open any back doors for you, but we definitely can help you increase probability and increase the strength of your application. That's our goal.
Absolutely. And an important question that we get a lot is how important is the MCAT and the GPA in terms of your chances of getting in? And you've probably seen some version of this chart online somewhere, but basically it is graphing people's GPA and their MCAT score and kind of what their percentage is of getting accepted to medical school. And this particular chart comes from the AAMC, so it's only for MD applicants. So if, for example, you have a 3.7 and you got a 512 on your MCAT, then you'd be at this 56.7% acceptance. So that does not mean that if you turned in 10 applications, you're getting accepted to 5.7 schools. That means that out of all of the applicants who had those statistics and only looking at those stats on their application, 56% of them or 57% of them got into one medical school, at least an MD school. And the rest of them did not get accepted. So obviously the MCAT is important. And if you look at, all of the applicants overall, a lot of people do get accepted and some people do not get in as well. And even if you look at these super high numbers of people with over a 3.79 GPA and over a 517 on their MCAT, it's not that 100% of them are getting in. So obviously, for the people that have lower numbers, that doesn't mean that that's the end of your application. And for people who have high numbers, it doesn't mean you can kind of just sit back and assume that you're going to get accepted. So schools are obviously looking for more than just your MCAT GPA. MCAT GPA are very important, but they're not everything.
Yeah, I kind of look at the MCAT and the GPA as getting you into the game. You're kind of getting you past that first filter and to the holistic phase of application review, where the admissions committees are actually reading your personal statement and reading your secondary application and so forth. So, I think there's some data out there that despite the doubling, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Dr. Chu, but despite the doubling of the volume of applicants over the last decade, the average cumulative GPA did not change. So that stayed around 3.75-ish, somewhere in there, of those that get accepted to allopathic medical school, MD school versus osteopathic schools. Those statistics are not in that data for osteopathic school. But the MCAT, the average did go up. The average MCAT of those that matriculate into allopathic medical school used to be around 508 or so, and I think it's up near 514 now. Am I correct on those numbers?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I haven't looked at the most recent MCAT averages, which when I last looked, which was I think a year or two ago, was around 512.
Okay.
But it might have bumped up from there.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I think I'm just kind of sensing that those numbers are going to get higher. You're
Yeah.
right. Now that you say that, it was 512 on the last data release. But even this past cycle, it just seemed like those averages even went higher, but I have nothing to back that objectively, which is most of what comes out of my mouth is not backed by objectives. Okay, I'll take this next step is the competencies that we're going to talk about. And if you're not familiar with this, the AAMC has a website that has delineated, I think, around 15 or so competencies that they feel are important for pre-medical students to kind of nurture through your undergraduate years. And this is what we really focus on, both in the application world as well as another service that we have is pre-med coach, where we work with students kind of earlier in other undergraduate years to kind of build their application. Is we resonate with these competencies and kind of then retrofit or try to find things then that will bring those competencies enhanced in their application. So for example, leadership is such a big quality of a physician. I mean, that's what really differentiates a physician from other healthcare professionals. And if a student doesn't have a lot of leadership on their application so far, or their resume, we'll think about, okay, what are some ways that we can get some leadership? And the leadership aspect of it sometimes is a bit misunderstood because people equate leadership with titles, and a title doesn't always equate to leadership, and leadership doesn't always require a title. So for example, students will say to me, oh, I was vice president of the physics club and treasurer of the pre-med interest group. I'm like, oh, that's fantastic, but what did you actually do in those roles? Well, not much. We didn't meet that often and yada, yada. Well, yeah, that's a title. That's not leadership. Whereas, for example, if you have a job outside of your academia, let's say you work at Culver's and you have to close every Thursday night, even though you're not designated, assistant manager or anything, that's leadership. You took on more responsibility than was expected you. So that's what I kind of hold as leadership, is taking on more responsibility than is kind of typical for that role. That's leadership. So what are, some of those other competencies, they're pretty common sense stuff, but you can look at the AAMC website and they're listed on this slide here too. But, things like cultural awareness, have you done any activities where you built that cultural awareness, cultural competency, learning from others different than you, growing your perspectives, teamwork, communication, empathy, things that are going to be part of your day-to-day life as a future physician.
Right. And I would say too, like as somebody who's done a lot of admin, it's not that we want you to list the actual competency themselves in the application, right? So when I see somebody trying to show or trying to list off these competencies to show me as a reader that they have accomplished these things, that's not as effective as you showing through the activities that you've done, that you have developed these skills. So your interpersonal skills, things like that, we're trying to show it through your activities and how you write them up, rather than trying to label everything as these competencies, if that makes sense.
That's a great point. When I was reading applications on the admissions committee, I read an applicant where they're like, I have great empathy, or I am a strong leader, and you're just like, okay, prove, I don't believe it, right?
Right.
Whereas if you read somebody's essays where they're, showing, well, this is what we say this all the time, show, don't tell, where they show it through describing a specific, scenario or vignette, and they don't even have to say it. It's even more powerful not to say it, that, I'm a great leader, because you just showed that to me through a beautiful story of leadership.
So if we kind of look at how can you show these things, then it's through basically your extracurricular activities, right? So if we look at all the different kind of extracurricular activities you can do, And we break them down into these 5 categories. That kind of covers all the major areas that med schools are generally looking for. So the first one would be clinical experience. So that is like hands-on direct patient care experience in a clinical setting. So those would be things like hospital volunteering or being a medical assistant or being an EMT, things like that, where you're working to provide medical care for a patient in some way. The second category would be volunteering. So the clinical one can be either volunteer or paid. The volunteering in this case is not clinical. So it's stuff that is outside of the hospital or medical setting. And schools, I think, want to see that you are willing to give back to your community without expecting something back in return. So it's best to choose volunteer activities that show off what you are genuinely enthusiastic about. So if you are passionate about helping people who are unhoused or people who are victims of domestic violence or working at a food pantry, whatever it is that you are genuinely passionate about and how you want to serve your community, that's how you want to show these non-clinical volunteering hours. Leadership, Dr. Nelson has talked about what kind of leadership experiences they're looking for, and mentorship is a big part of that as well. Research is obviously really important for, especially a lot of schools are very heavy in the research area. I think it's always good for people to have some research to show that you can handle working through the scientific method, and you can do that successfully. And then shadowing is just very useful and important to show that you don't have some sort of a fancy notion of what it's like to be a doctor. You have seen the boring stuff and you've seen the exciting stuff about being a doctor, and you still want to do it. So we want to show that you have experience seeing all of those things, and you are still committed to this path. So the best extracurricular experiences are going to be ones that are longitudinal. And don't get me wrong, med schools also want to see some variety. So it's not that you can have like 5 experiences and expect that that's enough because they were longitudinal, but they also want to see commitment. So it's better to have an experience that is more longitudinal than to have a bunch of little experiences where you didn't really stick to any of them at all. Also, the experiences that have leadership potential, that of course are based on your passions, is super important. I think Dr. Nelson and I have always read applications where it's like, they've clearly checked off all the boxes. But they clearly don't necessarily really care about any of them very much. I don't know what this person's driving passions are and why they want to become a physician. And so we want to make sure that you're doing extracurricular activities that you really love and are based on populations of people that you really care about. And also, if they can lead to a letter of recommendation, that's even greater, because the people who write you that letter have seen you in a context outside of school. So they know different sides of you and can really speak to a lot of your character, your work ethic, those kinds of things. And so it's really great if you can have strong longitudinal experiences that somebody is willing to write a strong letter for you for.
I'm taking notes, hang on. You had so much good things to say, I had to take some notes there. I'm going to just resonate with a couple of them just because you brought up
Sure.
so many good things, and they're so important. I just want to echo them because it's gold for these students that are listening. One is that non-clinical volunteering that you were talking about, where that's one of the few places that you can kind of interject your passion, that you can kind of interject your story into your extracurriculars. For example, you can't really tell who you are through shadowing. I mean, that's more of just, you have to do it. You have to check the box, making sure that you understand what you're getting yourself into. But with non-clinical volunteering, don't just check a box. Don't just kind of go and, stamp your time card at a soup kitchen or a food bank just because you've heard that would be good to do. And I use a term that I don't like, and I still use it because I can't think of any better term, and it's called a passion project. And I don't like it because it implies some sort of massive effort, and it's not. It just means have some intentionality in what you're volunteering in. For example, I had a student who was really struggling with this, and he's at Berkeley, and we're like, okay, well, what are you passionate about? He's like, I'm boring. I just go to school. That's all I do. And I'm like, well, we need to jazz this up a little bit then, because that's not going to work. And Like, what do you do for fun? What do you do when you're not studying? He's like, well, I do like to ride my bicycle. I'm like, okay, there's something. Let's start brainstorming on that. So we started brainstorming. We started looking around. He's in a wonderful organization now that he's actually trying to generate as an official club at Berkeley, where he gets together with a group of people like once every couple months for like 2 hours on a Saturday, and they build tricycles and they donate them to children with disabilities. I mean, that's just fabulous. That's just fabulous. And so that just shows that intentionality that this is important to me. It's important to me, and I wanted to give it to a group of people that are less fortunate. That is beautiful and really resonates, not just in like your personal statement, but on secondaries and interviews. I mean, that can just be really the difference between a great interview and a horrible interview is having that one thing that resonates or sticks out to your interviewer. And it really wasn't that much effort. It just takes some kind of thought and inward looking.
Right.
Um,
And I think that a lot of applicants don't think that those passions, those natural passions that they have are that important. Like bike riding, they think that's not going to help my application. But if you love cooking, do you want to teach cooking lessons to people who maybe have never learned? Or if you love reading, I have people who have started a book club in their local library for people in their communities, things like that. So whatever you love, be creative and proactive and try to think outside the box about how you can do some of that volunteer work.
Yeah, and taking that initiative, you don't always just have to follow something that's already established or already out there. And that was another a note I made of your excellent information is, that these extracurriculars are not mutually exclusive, meaning you can get leadership while you're volunteering in a clinical environment. So, for example, I have a student who started volunteering with hospice, which is one of my favorite volunteer outlets. I think it's just a profound volunteer and clinical experience for pre-med students, really engaging with patients in a difficult environment, getting comfortable navigating that difficult communication, communicating with families and so forth. Anyway, this student got involved with hospice. He then he then became a leader in that hospice organization. He's started working with the actual hospice office, and so it was a leadership, volunteer, and clinical experience. So kind of it touched on three of those different extracurriculars. Okay, I'm going to need some help with this next one, Dr. Chu. And I just realized that the title of this, um, of our little presentation here is how to get into medical school, everything you need to know. That is incredibly arrogant of us to think that we can, in 1 hour, tell you everything you need to know. But you know what? We'll do our best. Okay, we're going to talk about kind of the logistics of the application itself. And if there's a more, arduous, complicated process out there, I would argue to see if it's any worse than this. The application to medical school is so complicated and so drawn out, and it just keeps getting kind of layered each year with additional hurdles you have to jump through, like the addition of Casper and Preview and all these. Now we're doing hybrid interviews with MMI and tradition. It just gets layered and layered every year, more and more complicated. So we'll kind of give you a few of the things that go into the application itself, but we lied we can't tell you everything. So the primary application itself, which is due, if you're going to apply, let's say for the 25-26 cycle, that application is going to be wanting to be submitted at the end of May. That's when the application submission portal opens. The portal for the application itself, the centralized applications, opens at the beginning of May, but you can't submit it till the end of May. But there's these deceiving deadlines on each medical school's website that says, like our application is due by December 31st. Well, you might as well not even submit it then, because of rolling admissions, you have no chance at that time. So you really need to be in that first few days or few weeks of that application cycle to really maximize the probability or potential just from a time standpoint. And I'm going to bring out some fuzzy math and statistics here, Dr. Chu, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there was a study done on the TMDSAS application, the Texas application, because they're their own country and they have their own central application. So they did a study where if you have two students that are kind of equal on all those other parameters of MCAT, GPA, extracurriculars, whatever, and one student applies day one, the other student applies like a month into it, the student that applies late has a 10% chance, so a 90% reduction in probability just based on time alone. Am I getting those numbers correct?
I have not seen those numbers myself, but Dr. Nelson knows a lot more numbers than I do. But
I just make them
I'm
up.
not surprised at all, just because we've seen so many clients that have great applications that don't get accepted. And a lot of times, if you look through how the application cycle went, the one problem you can find is that it was submitted later than it should have been. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
I may have made those numbers up, but it's roughly that. So in that primary application, the efforts that go into that, you need to have your letters of recommendation kind of organized. You have to input all of your demographic and grades into the central application. But what the effort is the personal statement and the activities documents. And those are really vital in kind of getting on to that next interview phase where your probability goes up. So really putting a lot of thought and effort into those personal statement and activities. Personal statement is that a separate topic or should
No,
we talk about it here?
we can talk about it here.
The personal statement, you're really trying to get across not just why you want to be a doctor, but why you will be a good doctor. And how I explain this to students is, when you're on the admissions committee, you're not looking for the coolest reason why somebody wants to be a doctor. You want to have that as part of it, why this passion came out of you, where did it come from, but more so why you will be a good doctor. And that's where we really try to show those competencies through kind of different vignettes and extracurriculars, specific stories from that showing those competencies. Anything else that you'd say on the personal statement?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think that a lot of people feel like their personal statement has to show very, very, very unique motivations for wanting to become a doctor. But if you ask people why they wanted to become a doctor, most of them are gonna, like, the fundamental reason is to help people and because they like science, and so they thought it would be a nice combination that way. Maybe prestige and things like that is not part of the personal statement, but like basically everybody has like the basic same reasons for underlying for wanting to become a doctor. So I encourage people not to think about how can you be unique from everybody else, because sometimes if you're too unique and stand out too much, that some people are not, like, it doesn't read that well. But you just have to be genuine. And as long as they can see what your genuine motivations are and what you've done to explore this career and find that it's a good match for you and that you're a good match for it, that's going to be a strong personal statement. So having those stories, like Dr. Nelson was saying, that really illustrate your strengths and why you want to become a physician in a very genuine, very engaging way is going to be super important, because when they read that statement is when they want to invite you for an interview.
Absolutely. And I just had a meeting with one of my students last week where we were almost done creating her personal statement. She's like, I hate it. I hate my personal statement. I'm like, well, that's not good. We need to look at this. And the reason why is she wasn't genuine. She wasn't bringing that true emotion into it. And she was actually ignoring something that was very, very traumatic for her. That was the true reason why she wanted to go into medicine, but she was kind of stuffing it down and not wanting to even look at it. as soon as she started writing about that, I mean, it was like it just blossomed. Now she has a beautiful personal statement. So genuineness, I think that's a fantastic guide from Dr. Choo is be genuine and bring out that true emotion. Don't try to say what you think they want to hear. Tell them what's the truth and be emotional. All
In a
right.
professional way, right? Which is
Right.
how we can help you guys too. And that sometimes I've seen some people talk about their journey with depression, and the essay is so depressing that it's kind of like, whoa, I don't know that this is very engaging and helpful for the reader because it's just depressing. So we do want to hear about maybe if you want to talk about your journey with depression, but we want to present it in a way that the AdCom is really gonna enjoy and want to meet you in person.
Exactly. Exactly. I've actually had students write about some massive failures in their personal statement. Maybe even like getting an infraction at school for whatever reason, and they if they write about it from a growth and a learning standpoint, it can be very powerful.
Yeah.
And just not trying to hide that. All right, so the activities document is a bit more kind of mechanical. It's really just describing, what you did, how many hours, what you gained from doing it. What competencies did you work on when you're doing that? And then you have three of them where you have an additional amount of character space as your most meaningful, which you can now go into specific vignettes, just like the paragraphs in your personal statement. So I look at those three most meaningful as kind of three bonus paragraphs to your personal statement.
Right. And I know that there's a lot of advice online about making sure there's a story in every single activity. I'm personally not for that advice because it starts to read as very gimmicky. And if I can't tell what your role actually was in that activity because you're telling me about the sun glinting off the hillside when the then I'm not going to read the activity, So for crusty old people like myself, who are also potentially sitting on the admissions committee, I think the stories can be, like Dr. Nelson said, put in the most meaningful areas. And if you can integrate it in a few of the other ones, that's fine. But I would not try to make a fancy story out of every single activity.
It's so funny you say that because when I'm talking to students, I'm like, this is not the time to be creative.
Yes,
In fact,
agree.
if you go to the AAMC application PDF booklet or whatever it is, the instruction booklet, it says, it spells out very clearly,
Yeah.
here's how to write those 700 character main paragraphs.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you've
Mhm.
been on an admissions committee and you're reading hundreds of these applications, each one having up to 15 of those activities, you're just like, good, give me what I need.
Yes, exactly.
Enough with the noise.
Yes.
Just tell me what I need to know. Okay.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the main efforts with the primary application. Personal statement, activities, letters of rec, coursework, um, transcripts, that type of stuff. That gets submitted ideally at the end of May. It doesn't have to be that first hour, but within the first days, ideally. Uh, then it takes at least 4 weeks for AMCAS to verify that application. I think that's a good time to do a couple things. One is to do your situational judgment tests of Casper and Preview. Um, those are newer the last few years, and the myth out there on these is they're ethics exams. In fact, I've seen some just insanity on some of these social media things where they're like, you need to read these ethics books and whatnot. It's like, no, they are not ethics tests. They're situational judgment tests. They're testing your judgment skills, not your ethics knowledge. So really the best way to prepare for that is to get out and be in the real world and have to, have some judgment and make some judgment calls. You really can't prepare for it other than, preparing how to articulate yourself. But reading ethics books isn't going to help you. Agreed. Then at the end of June, if you submitted early enough, your primary application, if it's verified, gets transmitted to the schools that you designate. So this is kind of when your school list needs to be finalized, because you really only need to put one school to get verified. But once it's verified, now you want it transmitted so you can get in the queue at the medical schools right away. So you want those schools designated by the last week of June. Once that is transmitted to the schools, then schools typically reflex you a secondary application based really only on looking at your MCAT and GPA. They're not reading your personal statement for the most part or anything else. If you're above these set parameters, they'll send you a secondary. And the trick is they're time stamped and they need to be returned within a couple weeks. So you're going to get an onslaught of secondary applications all within a couple days of each other, and the timer is ticking on them. So during that verification phase of June, it's smart to start pre-writing some common secondary scenarios. Then once you submit your secondaries, kind of that mid-July, late July region, there's a bit of another lull as the admissions committee start doing their holistic review of applications in late August, early September, and then interview invites start going out in September, and then the interview season kind of goes through that next March-ish region. So the interview cycle is super long, kind of from September of 25, let's say, to the end of March of 26, which the secondary applications are the hardest from a work standpoint, but from a psychological standpoint, the interview season is the most difficult.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people are not prepared for that waiting period because they've been working, and writing, and then August, everything stops. And then they just go nuts because they're not used to sitting and just waiting. And so you do have to kind of be prepared. It's going to be a long time of a lot of times just waiting and hearing nothing. And that's normal. Your anxiety about it is also normal. So finding ways to deal with that and anticipate it, I think, is helpful.
Yeah, go add an additional volunteer effort or something during that time
Yeah.
because it still is impactful. You can still discuss it in your interviews or through an update letter. Okay, did I touch on everything?
No. We'll move on so that we can get to some of your questions too. But so now that we've said all of this stuff, what can you be doing to prepare for medical school, right? So you can sign up for admissions advising would be a great next step. So both Dr. Nelson and I are advisors with Med School Coach, and what we do is work one-on-one with different clients to work on their particular application, work on their own questions. We respond to all of your questions personally. We know all of our clients personally as well. And we also help with the writing aspect of it. We also have writing advisors who are specialists in writing more than Dr. Nelson and I are. And so we work as a team to help you guys craft the best application that you are capable of preparing. So if you are interested, all of us who are physician advisors are physicians. So we have all gone through this process successfully. And we also have a genuine passion to mentor and help the next generation of physicians as you all develop. So if you are interested in signing up for any advising services, feel free to scan the QR code here. This is not a QR code to book a meeting with Dr. Nelson. He's very in demand, but this QR code is for you to book a meeting with our enrollment team if you are interested in signing up with an advisor. So feel free to scan that in, meet with our enrollment team to talk about what the next steps would be like to work with someone like Dr. Nelson or myself. If you have questions, and I think you have been dropping them in the Q&A or the chat function, please feel free to put those in there and we will answer your questions now.
So I just want to say one thing about the advising through Med School Coach. The writing advisors are so vital,
Oh my God.
And I tell my students right off the bat, I am a terrible writer. And I know what needs to be in there. I know what like the ingredients that need to go into it, but I just can't make it sound good. And then, the person that founded this company, Dr. Sahil Mehta, brilliant guy, really in creating this triad of the student, physician advisor, writing advisor. And the writing advisors tend to be either PhDs in English or lawyers, just really masters of word choice and structure and ideas and so forth, transitions and themes. That process of that triad, I have never seen a bad outcome from that. And it's so cool to watch that blossoming of the written materials.
All right.
Good.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Nelson and Dr. Chu, for the presentation. And now we have about 20 minutes or so for the Q&A portion. And thank you to everyone who's been writing in the Q&A this whole time. We're going to get to as many questions as we can live, and the ones that we don't answer live, you're going to get emailed answers and responses as well later on. So thank you, and keep on asking those. This was an awesome presentation that really did kind of go over the broad scope of things to think about when applying to medical school. But of course, there's a lot of nuance there, and that's the benefit of what it sounds like with you working one-on-one with advisors who can really understand your personal journey the best and help prepare an application for medical school. But now, and remember, for everyone watching live, this is recorded. This will be sent to your email on Monday. You don't have to watch all of the sessions live, and you can take breaks. You can go to the bathroom. You can get food. This is all being recorded and will be sent to you. But to get into the first question, I saw a lot of questions in the chat from students like Nancy who were saying, maybe she hasn't taken the MCAT yet and needs to take the MCAT and needs to schedule it. Well, what's the best real timing to do that? And can you submit an application before the MCAT is done, or if you're waiting for a score? Dr. Nelson, what are your thoughts about kind of timing the MCAT to make sure you're as prepared as possible, but also you don't want to send it too late?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Katz, for being the host of this and moderating. It's just a pleasure to work with you. Nancy, thank you for that question. Love to hear Dr. Chu's perspective on this as well. But what I tell my students right off the bat, if they're kind of not sure on their timeline, this is a marathon, not a sprint. And if you're trying to kind of stuff things in and you're cutting your timeline shorter and shorter, you're gonna stumble and fall and not make it across the finish line. So if you're looking at this application cycle of 25-26, where the primary applications are going to be submitted in about 6 weeks, there is not enough time in there to begin preparing for the MCAT, take it, and still apply on time. Because there's good data out there that shows it takes a solid 3 to 6 months of designated MCAT prep in order to kind of maximize your score probability. So I would really, if you're at the beginning of your MCAT prep or just kind of preparing to start on it, then I would be looking at the 26-27 cycle and give yourself that ample time to prepare for it. And also give yourself some time to plug any other kind of gaps in your competencies.
I would say that if you have started studying already, then I would not take it later than May. Because if you get it in May, let's say end of May, you take your MCAT, you can still submit your application with one school on your list that you're sure you're going to apply to no matter what. And once your MCAT score is back about a month later, then you can finalize that school list, get it in before schools start receiving applications at the end of June. So that's why I recommend not going any later than May if you're going to be taking it this cycle and applying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a bunch of questions about shadowing. And just to help out, we created a shadowing series that's completely free. If you haven't yet checked it out, it's literally just shadowing.medschoolcoach.com. There's 25 hours of shadowing. It's right there in the chat, which you can do on your own time and get certificates for it, which all count towards your medical school application. And then another question that I saw in the chat was, this one's for Dr. Chu. It's about the number of hours for different extracurriculars and requirements. Carlos asks about the amount of hours that you really kind of tend to look for. Is there a minimum, whether it's shadowing or extracurriculars, or is it really more about what you make of the experience?
There are hours, and sometimes I hesitate to say them all just because they're nice minimums, but they're not everything, right? So, for example, with shadowing, I usually say minimum 50 to 100 hours, minimum 2 to 3 different shadowing specialties that you do. So 50 to 100 hours total. It's not that you have to do 100 hours for both. And if you have a little more than that, that's fine. I personally don't think you have to do much more than that because shadowing is somewhat of a limited experience. For something like clinical, I think that's one of the most important categories. And we generally say minimum 200 hours or so. But we're also looking at more than that. So if you did 200 hours working for a short amount of time over one summer, that doesn't look quite as good as getting that 200 hours over a longer period of time where you had to consistently go and participate in this activity. And I think 200 hours generally is quite low. So if you look at it, you're also competing with people that have graduated from college and are working full-time and have been working full-time, right? They have thousands of hours. So I think that a nicer minimum is probably in the 500 plus range if you can do it. That doesn't mean, a lot of times talking to me and Dr. Nelson can feel like you're trying to take sips from a fire hose, right? It's a lot of information and a lot of stuff you have to do. And I always tell people, I'm just telling you what would be ideal. That doesn't mean you have to do every single thing. The schools are going to do a holistic review of your application. So once you hear all these things, it's up to you to kind of figure out what is actually reasonable and that I'm able to and capable of doing in this amount of time. So same with volunteering that's not clinical. I generally recommend a minimum of 200 hours and a year. Generally 200 and a year of service is kind of what I say as kind of a minimum number.
Understood. Awesome. Thank you for that answer. And then, in just the interest of getting to as many questions as possible for Dr. Nelson, Deanna asked a little bit about kind of what specific requirements schools have. Like, do different medical schools have different requirements, or is there kind of a blanket requirement across the board? Have you noticed that certain medical schools might have particular ways that an applicant should tailor their application or additional things that they're looking for?
Good question. So, the short answer is no. They're pretty similar in what they're looking for as far as those general competencies that will make you succeed in being a doctor. There are some niches. I would say some of the more upper echelon schools like your Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Mayo. They want to see a lot more research on your application. But for the majority of other schools, they're looking kind of for all the same things. Now, if you're talking a prerequisite for a coursework, there are some nuanced differences in the prerequisites from school to school, but most schools require what we call the core prerequisites, which is a year of these courses with labs, biology, general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and then statistics, psychology, English composition, and math. So if you have those core prerequisites, the differences beyond that from school to school, you can take those courses before you start that school. For example, like University of Arizona Phoenix is one of the few medical schools in the U.S. that requires physiology, which is a very rare prerequisite. But you don't need physiology to apply to that school, but you can, if you get accepted, you can take physiology before you start. And that tends to be the differences between the schools.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Dr. Chu, a question for you from Bryce about being a non-traditional applicant. How does somebody who's, having a full-time job or has been outside of kind of just college or education for several years get back into it? How do you, advise students who are coming from a non-traditional background but want to switch careers and become physicians?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Bryce. We do advise a lot of people that are non-traditional applicants, and a lot of it is basically showing the medical school why you're making the switch, showing that you've investigated why this switch is the right switch for you, and having kind of showing that strong why for a non-traditional applicant. So it is important to get some kind of clinical / research / volunteer experience before you apply. So if you only had those experiences during college, and now it's 7 years later and you haven't done anything clinical or research or volunteer since then that doesn't look as good as you've been working and you've been volunteering on the weekends at some free clinic or something like that, so that they can see that you have started to investigate the pre-medical path and you've done some recent work in those areas and you found that this is XYZ reasons why you want to make that switch. So it requires some thought and planning and making sure you're like doing stuff that is vital for for furthering your application chances. So non-traditional people, I think, need to be very intentional with what they choose to do with their time and everything, but it's certainly possible. And I think medical schools really love people like that because you have more life experience, more work experience, things like that, and bring a lot to the table that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the next session, in just about 10 minutes, we're going to hear directly from three deans, current deans of medical schools, and we'll be able to ask them Q&A questions as well. But for the next 10 minutes, Dr. Nelson, a quick question for you is expanding upon this idea of non-traditional applications. What have you seen in terms of trends with students taking gap years, and what are certain ways that people can, use those gap years to strengthen an application?
Absolutely. Thank you. The trend in gap years has gone kind of the opposite from where it was when I applied to medical school in 1991, which, yeah, that was a long time ago. Most people did not do a gap year. I think that the numbers on that are around 10% of students did gap years at that point. Now it's flipped. Now 80% of students are taking a gap year, and the admissions committees really want to see those gap years, at least one, if not two, because there's so much good life experience, life maturation that happens in that really sets that student up for better success. And so the admissions committees are looking for that. If you're wondering what to do during that gap year, there's a myriad of things you can do. If your undergraduate coursework grades are lower than average as far as your GPA, getting a master's of science in medical science is a great use of your time. It mirrors the first year of medical school curriculum. It's your ability to prove that you can do well in that environment. Go work as an EMT or a phlebotomist. Get that really solid clinical experience. But don't just do that. You can get a job as an EMT or a phlebotomist and then do some non-clinical volunteering as well. But just being efficient about gaining as many of those competencies that you can to then translate onto your application.
Absolutely. Dr. Chu, question for you from Maria, who says she's pursuing research and service together, but some schools might emphasize more of a research mission versus other schools might, emphasize more of a service commitment. Do you recommend students tailor the medical school list that they make and apply to different medical schools based on what their strengths are in the application?
Yes, so Maria, I think that depends, it kind of depends on that person's goals. I think it's important to be looking at what schools might be a good fit for you. So if a school is really heavily research and you didn't really like research and you kind of did it to just check it off the box, then probably those big research schools, you just wouldn't be as happy there because they're going to really emphasize that research in their curriculum. Similarly, some of the schools that don't really emphasize research as much, maybe you really want to make sure that you have a heart for your community. And if you don't have that community service hours in, then they may not be as happy to have you there. So looking at the school's mission, looking at what their students tend to go into, looking at kind of what your own passions are, I think you should tailor the school list to what, if you have hard leanings one way or another, that you should try to choose mostly schools that kind of lean the same way that you do.
That's very, very helpful. Thanks. Jen asks a question for you, Dr. Nelson, which is actually something Dr. Chang talked about in his keynote speech today about kind of having interests and hobbies that maybe not necessarily 100% relate to clinical medicine. How do you, weave in hobbies into an application, and how do you express that side of yourself that isn't maybe just 100% related to practicing medicine, but you're still a big part of who you are?
Great question. So it's no secret that there's a huge problem with burnout in medicine. And with the hobbies part of your application, show how that hobby balances your work life. Show how that really centers you from all these other things that you have going on, and they can be weaved in beautifully. I had a student that wrote about collecting sports cards, like baseball cards. And he wrote about it as a hobby on his application. And at first I'm like, oh boy, that's that's not gonna work. It was amazing because it turned out it was like a family thing, and it was a competition amongst the family. And it was a designated time every week that they got together, and just uh, the growth that came out of that, just that hobby was phenomenal.
Gotcha. Yeah, there's always a way to weave in the growth that you can get from the interest that you do. It's not all about just having an application that's completely dedicated to practicing medicine. There's a lot more that makes us who we are than that. But one of the ways to get a clinical experience, like you mentioned, is being an EMT or being a phlebotomist. What are some other interesting types of clinical experience, Dr. Chu, that you've seen students who you've worked with have? Like, what are some of their backgrounds? What are some ways to get involved in patient care and to really make sure this career is right for somebody?
Yeah, so the most common ones that we see are hospital volunteering, free clinic volunteering. I would say MA and EMT are probably the most common. Scribing is common as well. I have lost my enthusiasm for scribing as an activity in that if it's your only clinical experience, I have found that people tend to have a hard time coming up with interesting things to talk about that show off the competencies in their application because everything they've done is observational. They never really interact with the patient. So if it's the only thing you can get, it's better than not having clinical experience. But I tend to push people to not necessarily do all of their experience describing because then they don't have as much to show their own strengths as much. I've seen people be EKG technicians, um, transport people in the hospital, um, radiology technicians, even some people that were like pharmacy technicians who, even though it's not being a doctor, they, still had to interact a lot with people. Um, so phlebotomy is another one. Sometimes I think jobs are a little harder to get, at least in my area, for phlebotomy, but you definitely have to calm down a lot of nervous patients and have some technical skill to be a phlebotomist. So there's a lot of different things you can do. A lot of the ones that are really heavily clinical and that show the best are ones that you do need to get some kind of certification for. And so if you're taking a gap year, I think it is worth it to get that certification and get that job where you are really working heavily with patients. But there's a lot of things out there. You kind of have to see what's available in your area and what interests you. Hospice is another one too, as long as you're working directly with the patient. Some people do CNA, patient care technicians, those kinds of things as well are very heavily patient centered.
That was incredibly helpful. I mean, that's a whole list that I'm sure somebody can find something within that resonates and can work as a possible option for clinical experience. And in the last minute or so that we have, I want to ask each of you, starting with Dr. Nelson, just overall, the single biggest piece of advice you have, and I know that kind of feels like it might be a loaded question, but just for the 900 students who are watching live and everybody else who's going to watch afterwards, what is the single biggest piece of advice you have for somebody interested in becoming a doctor? Dr. Nelson.
It's a marathon, and slow down, kind of enjoy that undergraduate experience and maybe gap year experience, and be intentional about the things that you invest your time into.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I would also say, know yourself. I think a lot of people are so focused on checking off the boxes, but you got to get to know yourself and what you love, or what you're passionate about, and what you want to continue pursuing in the future. So learning those things and getting involved in the stuff that you really love, I think is part of what really showcases who you are and can be the tipping point for getting in successfully.
Gotcha. Then, with that being said, Dr. Chu, Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for doing this 1 hour session about pretty much the whole swath of information that's needed to know about getting into medical school. I know that was a lot, and I know there's a lot of nuance there. So, of course, we have the link up here if students are interested in one-on-one advising, which is obviously super helpful.